I stood on her porch, clutching the worn paperback, its edges frayed from too many late-night reads. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, and I figured it was as good a time as any to return the book I'd borrowed months ago. I hadn't seen her in a while, and the guilt of holding on to her copy of The Bell Jar had started to nag at me. I knocked, expecting a quick exchange, hand over the book, maybe chat for a minute, then head home. But when the door swung open, there she was, standing in a silk robe that clung to her like a second skin, her hair slightly damp, like she just stepped out of the shower. She looked at me, her eyes sharp and unreadable, and said, "You came just in time." My stomach dropped. I didn't know what she meant, but the way she said it, soft and deliberate, made it clear this wasn't about the book. I'd known her for years, not well, but enough to call her a friend. We met at a community book club, one of those gatherings where people sip cheap wine and pretend they've read the assigned chapters. She was different though, always cutting through the small talk with a comment that made you think twice. Her name was Elise, and she had this way of looking at you like she could see straight through to the parts you didn't want anyone to notice. I'd borrowed the book after one of those meetings when we'd ended up talking late into the night about Sylvia Plath and the weight of words. She'd pressed it into my hands saying, "You'll get it. Just bring it back when you're done." That was 6 months ago. Life got in the way. Work, errands, the usual excuses. And I hadn't seen her since until now. I stood there, book in hand, trying to make sense of her words. "In time for what?" I asked, my voice catching slightly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped back, gesturing for me to come inside. The air in her house was warm, scented with something like lavender and cedar, and the lights were low, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I hesitated. This wasn't the quick drop-off I'd planned, but there was something in her expression, a mix of urgency and calm that pulled me forward. I stepped inside and she closed the door behind me with a soft click. "I was about to call you," she said, walking toward the living room. Her robe swished lightly as she moved, and I tried not to notice the way it shifted against her legs. "You still have that knack for showing up when it matters." I didn't know what she was talking about, but I followed her anyway. The book still clutched in my hands like a shield. The living room was cluttered in a way that felt intentional. Books stacked on every surface, papers strewn across a coffee table, a laptop glowing faintly in the corner. It looked like she'd been working on something or maybe digging through something and hadn't stopped for days. "What's going on, Elise?" I asked, setting the book down on a side table. She turned to face me, and for the first time, I noticed the shadows under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she brushed her hair back. "I need your help," she said, her voice low but steady. "I found something big, and I can't do this alone." My first thought was that she was exaggerating. Maybe she'd stumbled across some old letters or a family secret in her attic. But the way she was looking at me like she was measuring whether I could handle whatever came next told me this was different. She motioned for me to sit and I sank onto the couch, the cushions sagging under my weight. She didn't sit. Instead, she paced, her bare feet silent against the floor. "You know how I've been working on that research project?" she said. I nodded vaguely, recalling her mentioning something about local history. Maybe Old Town records during one of our book club talks. "It started small," she went on. "I was just looking into the history of this house, trying to figure out who lived here before me. It's old, built in the 1800s. I thought it would be fun, like a hobby, but then I found something in the basement." I leaned forward. My curiosity piqued despite the unease creeping up my spine. "What kind of something?" I asked. She stopped pacing and looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly like she was deciding how much to tell me. "A box," she said finally, locked heavy, hidden under a loose floorboard. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I got it open, there were documents, letters, maps, even a journal. They weren't just old. They were specific. Names, dates, places, things that don't add up with what we know about this town. I didn't know where she was going with this, but the way she was talking, the intensity in her voice made it hard to dismiss. "Okay," I said slowly. "So, you found some old papers. What's the big deal?" She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. The big deal, she said, is that these aren't just papers. They're proof. Proof that something happened here. Something that was covered up. And I think someone's been watching me since I found them. My mouth went dry. Watching you? I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, crossing her arms over her chest. I've been hearing things at night. Footsteps, doors creaking when I know I locked them. And last week, I came home and found my desk drawers open. Papers moved. Someone's been in here and I don't think they're happy I found that box. I wanted to tell her she was being paranoid, that old houses make noises and maybe she'd just forgotten to close the drawers. But the look on her face stopped me. She wasn't the type to jump at shadows. If she thought someone was watching her, she had a reason. Why me? I asked. Why do you need my help? She hesitated, then walked over to the coffee table and picked up a small leather-bound notebook. Because you're the only one I trust, she said, handing it to me. And because you're good at puzzles, this is one you're going to want to solve. I opened the notebook, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was neat, but faded. And as I skimmed the first few lines, I realized it wasn't just a journal. It was a record. Dates, locations, names of people I'd never heard of, interspersed with cryptic phrases like the pact must hold. And the river hides the truth. I looked up at Elise, who was watching me closely. What is this? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. You're going to need a drink for this, she said, pouring a generous amount into each glass. She sat down across from me, her robe slipping slightly off one shoulder. And for a moment, I was distracted by how different she seemed from the Elise I'd known at book club. There was an edge to her now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. The journal, she said, taking a sip of her drink, belonged to someone who lived here in 1008-173. His name was Thomas Carver. He was a surveyor, or at least that's what he called himself. But from what I've pieced together, he was part of something else, something secret. A group of people in this town made a deal, a kind of agreement. And it wasn't just about land or money. It was about something they found in the river. I took a sip of the whiskey, the burn grounding me as my mind raced. The river? I asked. She nodded. The one that runs through the edge of town. It's in the journal. References to a gift they found in the water. Something they thought was valuable, maybe even sacred, but it came with a cost. People started disappearing. And the ones who didn't, they changed. The journal doesn't spell it out, but there are hint rituals, symbols, things that sound like they were trying to keep something contained. I flipped through the journal, my eyes catching on a sketch of a strange spiraling symbol that looked like it had been drawn in haste. This is a lot, I said, trying to process it. You think this is real? Not just some guy's weird diary? Elise leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I didn't believe it at first either, but then I started cross-referencing the names in the journal with Old Town records. They're real. Every single one of them, and the disappearances, they're documented, 2 newspaper clippings, police reports. People went missing along that river for years. And then it just stopped, like someone made it stop. I set the journal down, my hands unsteady. And you think someone's after you because of this? I asked. She nodded. I started digging deeper, asking questions, visiting the library, the historical society. I even went down to the river to see if I could find anything. That's when I started noticing things. Cars slowing down as they passed my house. Shadows moving outside my windows at night. I don't know who they are, but I think they know I'm getting close to something they don't want found. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her to go to the police. But what would she even tell them? That she found an old journal and now she thinks she's being watched. They'd laugh her out of the station. But sitting there looking at the intensity in her eyes, I couldn't dismiss it. What do you need me to do? I asked finally. She smiled, but it was tight, like she was relieved, but still on edge. I need you to help me figure out what this means, she said, tapping the journal. There's a map in there and I think it leads to something. Maybe whatever they found in the river, but I can't do it alone. I need someone who can think clearly, who won't just write this off as crazy. I took another sip of whiskey, letting it settle my nerves. Okay, I said. I'm in. But if we're doing this, we're doing it carefully. No running off to the river in the middle of the night. Got it. She laughed. And this time it felt genuine. Deal, she said. But we need to start tonight. I don't know how much time we have. That night, we sat at her kitchen table, the journal, and a pile of papers spread out between us. She'd pulled out everything she'd found. Old newspaper articles, photocopies of town records, even a topographic map of the area around the river. The journal was our guide. But it wasn't easy to follow. The entries were fragmented, written in a way that felt like Thomas Carver was afraid someone might read them. We spent hours piecing things together, referencing names and dates, trying to make sense of the cryptic phrases. The more we read, the more unsettling it got. There were references to the Keepers, a group who seemed to be in charge of whatever this secret was, and mentions of a binding that had to be renewed every few years. It sounded like a cult, or at least something close to it, and the idea that it might still be active sent a chill down my spine. Around midnight, Elise stood up and stretched, her robe slipping again. I looked away, focusing on the map instead. This spot, I said, pointing to a bend in the river marked with a faint X in the journal. Keeps coming up. He mentions it over and over like it's important. She leaned over my shoulder, her breath warm against my ear as she studied the map. That's where I went last week, she said quietly. There's nothing there now, just rocks and trees, but it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't like the sound of that, but I didn't say so. Instead, I suggested we call it a night and pick up again tomorrow. She agreed, but as I stood to leave, she grabbed my arm. Stay, she said, her voice soft but firm, just for tonight. I don't want to be alone. I hesitated, but the look in her eyes, part fear, part determination, made it impossible to say no. I slept on her couch, the journal on the coffee table beside me, its pages seeming to hum with secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. The next morning, we drove to the river. The air was crisp, the kind of early autumn chill that makes your breath visible. The spot marked on the map was a good half-mile hike from the road through dense trees and uneven ground. Elise led the way, her backpack stuffed with a flashlight, a notebook, and a small trowel in case we needed to dig. When we reached the bend in the river, it was just as she described. Nothing but rocks and trees, the water moving slow and dark. But she was right about one thing. Felt wrong. The air was too still, the sounds of birds and insects muted, like the place was holding its breath. We spent an hour searching, looking for anything that might match the journal's descriptions. A marker, a carving, anything. I was about to suggest we head back when Elise froze, her eyes fixed on a cluster of rocks near the water's edge. There, she said, pointing. I followed her gaze and saw it. A faint spiral carved into one of the stones, almost identical to the one in the journal. It was weathered, barely visible, unless you knew what to look for. This is it, she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement or fear. Couldn't tell which. We approached the rock, and I noticed something else. A small flat stone at its base, out of place among the others. It looked like it had been set there deliberately, like a cover. Elise knelt down and pried it up with the trowel, revealing a shallow hollow underneath. Inside was a metal tin, rusted but intact. My heart was pounding as she lifted it out, her hands shaking. This is what they were hiding, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She opened the tin and inside was a single object, a small smooth stone etched with that same spiral symbol. It didn't look like much, but holding it in my hand, it felt heavy, like it carried a weight that had nothing to do with its size. We didn't have time to process it. A twig snapped behind us, loud in the unnatural quiet. I turned, expecting to see an animal, but there was nothing, just the trees and the river. Elise grabbed my arm, her grip tight. We need to go, she said, shoving the stone into her pocket. We moved quickly, retracing our steps, the tin tucked under my arm. The whole way back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder expecting to see someone following us, but no one was there. At least no one we could see. Back at her house, we locked the doors and spread everything out on the table. The journal, the map, the stone. Elise was convinced the stone was the key, that it was what the keepers I had been protecting. I wasn't so sure, but I couldn't deny the way it felt in my hand, like it was pulling at something inside me. We spent the next few days digging deeper across, referencing everything we could find. The journal mentioned a ritual, something about renewing the binding at the river, but it was vague, like Thomas Carver was afraid to write too much. We found more references to the keepers, names that matched prominent families in the town's history, some of whom still lived here. The more we learned, the more uneasy I felt. Elise was relentless, barely sleeping, her eyes bright with a kind of manic energy. I tried to keep up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in over our heads. Then one night it happened. I was at her house going through a stack of old newspapers when the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, the only sound was our breathing. Then a knock at the door, slow, deliberate, like whoever was there wanted us to know they weren't going away. Elise grabbed my hand, her fingers cold. "Don't answer it," she whispered. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the door might splinter. I pulled out my phone, ready to call for help, but there was no signal. Elise was shaking now, her eyes wide with fear. "They know," she said. "They know we have it." I didn't need to ask who they were. I grabbed the journal and the stone, shoving them into my bag. "We need to get out of here," I said, pulling her toward the back door. We slipped out into the night, the air cold against my skin. The knocking stopped as we ran, but I could still feel it like a pulse in my chest. We didn't stop until we reached my car parked a block away. I drove, my hands tight on the wheel, not knowing where we were going, only that we couldn't stay. We ended up at a motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asks questions. Elise was quiet, her face pale in the dim light of the room. "What do we do now?" I asked, setting the bag with the journal and stone on the table. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took the stone out and held it, her thumb tracing the spiral. "We figure out what they're protecting," she said finally. "And we stopped them." I didn't know if I believed in the keepers or the river or whatever this stone was supposed to mean, but I believed in Elise, and I believed in the fear in her eyes. So I nodded and we got to work. Over the next few days, we pieced together more of the puzzle. The journal hinted at a cycle, something that had to be renewed every few decades to keep whatever was in the river contained. The stone was part of it, a kind of anchor, but we still didn't know what it was anchoring. We started reaching out to people discreetly through emails and burner phones. A historian in the next town, a retired librarian who'd worked at the Historical Society, anyone who might know something. Most of them brushed us off, but one, an old man named Harold, who'd lived here his whole life, agreed to meet us. He was KY, his voice low over the phone, but he said he knew about the river, about the old promises that kept the town safe. We met him at a diner far enough from town that no one would recognize us. Harold was frail, his hands trembling as he sipped his coffee, but his eyes were sharp. "You found the stone," he said. Not a question. I glanced at Elise, who nodded slightly. "What is it?" I asked. He leaned forward, his voice barely audible. "It's a marker," he said. "A warning. They thought they could control it, but they were wrong. People died because of it, and they'll die again if you don't put it back." I felt a chill, but Elise pressed him. "Put it back where?" she asked. He shook his head. "To the river where it belongs. But you won't do it alone. They're watching, and they don't let go easily." He wouldn't say more no matter how much we pushed. He left the diner, his coffee half finished, and we didn't see him again. That night back at the motel, Elise was more determined than ever. "We're not putting it back," she said, her voice fierce. "Not until we know what it is." I didn't argue. I was too tired, too caught up in the momentum of it all. But I couldn't shake Harold's words or the way he looked at us like we were already doomed. The next day, we went back to the river. It was a risk, but Elise was convinced we'd missed something. We searched for hours, the stone heavy in my pocket. It was late afternoon when we found it. A small cave hidden behind a tangle of roots and vines near the spot where we'd found the tin. Inside, the walls were covered in carvings, spirals, and symbols that matched the journal. At the center was a shallow pool of water, black and still, reflecting the dim light of our flashlights. Elise knelt beside it, her face pale. "This is it," she said. "This is where it started." I didn't know what she meant, but before I could ask, I heard it. A low hum like a vibration in the air. The stone in my pocket felt warm, almost pulsing. I pulled it out, and the hum grew louder, the carvings on the walls seeming to glow faintly. Elise looked at me, her eyes wide. "Do you feel that?" she asked. I nodded, my throat tight. We didn't have time to figure it out. Footsteps echoed outside the cave, heavy and deliberate. I grabbed Elise's hand, pulling her back toward the entrance, but it was too late. Shadows moved in the dim light, and I saw them. 3 figures, their faces obscured by hoods. They didn't speak, but I could feel their intent, the weight of their presence. Elise clutched the stone, her knuckles white. "We can't let them have it," she whispered. I don't know how we got out. It was a blur. Running, stumbling, the sound of pursuit behind us. We made it to the car, my hands shaking as I turned the key. They didn't follow us, or if they did, we lost them. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were far from the town, far from the river. Elise was silent, the stone still in her hand, her face set in a way that scared me more than the figures in the cave. We're still running in a way. We've been moving from place to place, staying in motel, looking over our shoulders. The journal and the stone are with us, and every night, Elise reads through it, searching for answers. I don't know what we're going to do or if we can ever go back. But I know one thing. I came to return a book, and now I'm part of something I can't escape. Elise was right. I came just in time. But for what? I'm still not sure.